Hey everybody, book number 55, Curious George Rides a Bike by H.A. Rey. One name on the cover, you guys know what that means now. That person did all of the words and all the pictures. And if you write the words, you're an author, and if you draw the pictures, you're an illustrator. Curious George is one of the most favorite characters of most children in the United States. George is the monkey. And in the first book, we learned that the man with the yellow hat finds George in Africa and brings him home to the United States. And this is one of George's other stories. Curious George rides a bike. This is George. He lives with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. This morning, George was curious the moment he woke up because he knew it was a special day. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we are going to celebrate because just 3 years ago this day, I brought you home with me from the jungle. So tonight, I'll take you to the animal show. But first, I have a surprise for you." Ooh, that's a really big box. It says Express and handle with care. He's got his hammer. He's using the pry bar side of the hammer. He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George was very curious. Whoa! Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted. He knew how to ride a bicycle, but he had never had one of his own. "I must go now," said the man, "but I'll be back in time for the show. Be careful with your new bike. Keep close to the house while I'm gone." George could ride very well. He could even do all sorts of tricks. Monkeys are good at that. For instance, he could ride this way with both hands off the handle. And he could ride this way like a cowboy on a wild bronco. He could even ride backwards. But after a while, George got tired of doing tricks. He went out into the street. The newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of papers. "That's a fine bike you got there," he said to George. "How would you like to help me deliver papers?" He handed George the bag and told him to do one side of the street first and then turn back and do the other. George was very proud as he rode off on his bike. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street, as he had been told. When he came to the last river house, he saw a little river in the distance. George was curious. He wanted to know what the river was like, so instead of turning back to deliver the rest of the papers, he just went on. There's a man fishing. There's some ducks. There's some boys with boats. There was a lot to see at the river. A man was fishing from the bridge, a duck family was paddling downstream, and two boys were playing with their boats. George would have liked to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boys might find out he had not delivered all the papers, so he rowed on. What's he thinking about? Boys with the boats. What's he doing? While riding along, George kept thinking of boats all the time. It would be so much fun to have a boat, but how could he get one? He thought, and he thought, and then he had an idea. Uh-oh, George. He got off the bicycle, took a newspaper out of the bag, and began to fold it. First, he folded down the corners like this. Then he folded up both edges. He brought the ends together and flattened its sides. Then he turned up one corner, then the other one. He brought the ends together again and flattened it sideways. Then gently he pulled the ends open, and there was his boat. And you can Google search how to do this. But I remember when I was your age, leaving the book open and getting out one of my daddy's newspapers and making a paper boat. They do work. You can do it with a big newspaper and you get a pretty big boat. You can do it with smaller paper and get a smaller boat. And they do float in the bathtub. Uh-oh, George. Now the moment had come to launch the boat. Would it float? It did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he used up all the papers, and he made so many boats that he could not count them. A whole fleet of boats. Watching his fleet sail down the river, George felt like an admiral, but watching his fleet, he forgot to watch where he was going. Oh no, poor George. Suddenly there was a terrible jolt. The bicycle had hit a rock and George flew off the seat head first. Luckily, George was not hurt, but his front wheel of the bicycle was all out of shape and the tire was blown. Means it got a hole in it. Doesn't look like you could ride it very well that way. George tried to ride the bike, but of course it wouldn't go. So he started carrying it, but it got so heavy, George did not know what to do with his new bike. It was spoiled. The newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. No, he just stood there and cried. Suddenly, his face brightened. He'd forgotten he could ride on one wheel. He'd tried it and it worked. He'd hardly started out again when he saw something he had never seen before rolling towards him. He came on an enormous tractor with a huge trailer. Behind it, looking out of the trailer, were all sorts of animals. To George, it looked like a zoo on wheels. See the kangaroo and the ostrich? The tractor stopped and the two men jumped out. "Whoa, whoa," said one of the men, "a little monkey who can ride a bike Bronco fashion. We could use you in our animal show tonight. I'm the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat in no time, and then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be." Where they put his bike at the end. So the three of them got into the cab and drove off. Maybe you could play a fanfare while you ride your bike in the show, the director said. I have a bugle for you right here. Later on, you can get a coat and a cap, just like Bob's. Look at all the tractors and animals. Everyone's really busy getting ready for the show. On the show grounds, everybody was busy getting things ready for the show. I must do some work now, said the director. Meanwhile, you may have a look around and get acquainted with all the animals. But you must not feed them, especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything and might get very sick afterwards. An ostrich sounds like maybe it's like a goat. It will eat almost anything. Uh-oh. George. George was curious. Would the ostrich really eat anything? He couldn't eat a bugle, or would he? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But a bugle is hard to swallow, even for an ostrich, and it got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out of the bugle as the ostrich struggled with it, all blue in the face. George was frightened. Fortunately, the men heard the noise. They came rushing to the cage and got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. The director was very angry with George. We cannot use little monkeys who don't do as they are told, he said. Of course, you cannot take part in the show now. We will have to send you home. George had to sit on a bench all by himself, and nobody even looked at him. He was terribly sorry for what he had done, but now it was too late. He had spoiled everything. Uh-oh, what's the ostrich doing? Meanwhile, the ostrich, always hungry, had got hold of a string dangling near its cage. This happened to be the string which held the door to the cage of the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened and the baby bear got out. He ran away as fast as he could and made straight for a high tree near the camp. Nobody had seen it but George, and George was not supposed to leave his bench. But this was an emergency, so he jumped up, grabbed the bugle, and blew as loud as he could. Then he rushed to his bicycle. The men had heard the alarm and thought that first George had been naughty again. But when they saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling at the string, they knew what had happened. George raced to the tree far ahead of the men, but now the bear had climbed quite high, and this was dangerous because little bears can climb up a tree easily, but they have a hard time getting down. They might fall and get hurt. The men were worried. They did not know how to get him down safely, but George had a plan. With the bag over his shoulder, he went up the tree as fast as only a monkey can, and when he reached the top, he got to the baby bear, put him in the bag, and carefully let him down so the men could catch him safely. Everyone cheered when George had come down from the tree. You are a brave little monkey, said the director. You saved the baby bear's life. Now you get your coat back, and of course you may ride your bike and play the bugle in the show. Finally, the show was on. And then how surprised they were when right in the middle of it, oh, can't read this one. It goes all the way across. I can't fold the page in half. Finally, the show was on. The whole town had come to see it. And how surprised they were to discover George on his bike right in the middle of it. The newsboy was there too, and also the man with the yellow hat. Who had been looking for George everywhere and was happy to find him at last. The newsboy was glad to have his bag back, and the people from the other side of the street, whose papers George had made into boats, were not angry with him anymore. George! When the time had come for George to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and the cap and the bugle, and then George and his friend with the yellow hat got into the car and went home. Good night, George. Curious George rides a bike.